Camille, you're a tough act to follow. And we're going to switch the subject a little bit to a very different sort of book. I'm Rachel Clayman. I'm an executive editor at Crown, and it gives me enormous pleasure to tell you a little bit about Lauren Hilgers, the author of Patriot #1. Lauren is a superb reporter who speaks fluent Mandarin and who writes with understatement and wit. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Wired, Harper's, Business Week, and the New York Times Magazine. In fact, in the next month or two, you'll be seeing a new piece by her in the Times Magazine about an eccentric, exiled Chinese billionaire who is blowing the whistle on the Chinese elite. Patriot #1 takes us deep into the lives of two married Chinese immigrants in Flushing's Chinatown, Zhuang and Little Yan. It's possible that you'd encounter Zhuang driving an Uber, or Little Yan working at a nail salon. But even if you did, neither of them speaks much English, which is why we need this book to give us a window into their lives. And Zhuang is as compelling a character as any one in a novel. He's proud and stubborn, he's irrepressible, he's filled with brash enthusiasm, and he's hovering between two worlds, fully belonging to neither, which I think is the story that many immigrants face, at least during their early years in the United States. In the Chinese village he left, he was a political activist under the online alias Patriot #1. Yet when he arrives in New York, he is no longer the hero of a pro-democracy movement. He is an unknown immigrant, like so many others, trying to find an affordable apartment to rent. Now, Americans are, as you know, in the middle of a roiling conversation about immigration. And immigrants from Mexico and Central America are in an especially precarious position right now. So much of the focus has rightly been on them. I think few people realize that in 2015, China was one of the leading countries of origin for immigrants, topped only by India. So first, India was the leading country, followed #2 is China, and #3 is Mexico. In fact, in the last decade, the number of recent Chinese immigrants to the US has nearly tripled. So Chinese immigrants are also a very important part of America's immigrant story, but one that has been less reported on. I think this book fills in that missing part of the story, and it's wonderful, and I hope you find it as illuminating as I did. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi. Thank you, Rachel, and I'm very honored to be here with all of you, and really excited to be talking to a group of librarians. I've never worked as a librarian, but I have two library anecdotes that I never get to tell, and I'm really excited. My grandmother, I grew up in Texas, and my grandmother was a librarian, and she founded the Elroy Community Library in this little unincorporated town. She was a very determined woman, and she sort of built it from the ground up. She did all the fundraising, she got people to donate books. And the other thing about my grandmother was that she was a terrible gossip. She was like one of these she was a little old lady before her time. She really embraced the folksiness of growing old. And she would take your one hand in her two hands and like gaze in your eyes and ask you probing questions, which was terrible if you were her teenage granddaughter. But if you were, the community of Elroy really loved it. And so this library became sort of a center of literature and knowledge and gossip, all mixed in together. And it had a really big impact on me growing up, kind of that everyone's stories, the people in the town had stories that mixed in with all of this literature and these books. And the second library that has been important in my life, and it was actually important in reporting this book, is the Flushing Library in Queens. It's an amazing library. So the Chinese immigrants that I followed for this book all live in Flushing, and the Flushing, it's the center of the community. There's English classes. It's huge. There's 4 floors, really, if you count the basement. And it's also, when you're a reporter with a baby at home, it's a really great place to pump breast milk. I started back reporting when I had a 4-month-old child, and I had like a manual pump and a little ice bag, a little ice pack, and was constantly calculating when I could get away, and where I would get away to, so I could pump breast milk for 20 minutes. And the Flushing Library saved my life like many times. There's a basement bathroom that's really pretty underutilized and quiet. Patriot, why I was hiding out in your bathroom was to research this book, Patriot #1, which is about Chinese immigrants and the American dream, and it's centered on this one couple, Zhuang Liahong and his wife, Little Yan. And I thought the best way to introduce the book to you is probably tell the story of how I met them. I speak Mandarin. I lived in China from 2006 to 2012. I was sort of getting my start as a magazine writer. And one of the last assignments I got sent on before I moved back to New York, or moved back to the U.S., to New York, was to go down to this little village in southern China called Wuhan. And Wuhan had this amazing protest. It was like a small revolution. It was this tiny village, and they had found out, the villagers had discovered that their land was being stolen and sold off for a profit for local officials. So the local officials were sort of shrinking the footprint of this village little by little. And so they started protesting about it, and then one thing led to another, and there was this sort of spectacular standoff in late 2011 where they had blockaded all the roads, and the military-style police was on one side, and the villagers were on the other with like sticks. And it got a lot of coverage at the time. There was a lot of journalists sort of sneaking in. Wuhan is also on the coast, and they had the Coast Guard out, so the fishermen couldn't go out, and people had to walk food in. And the other incredible thing about it was that they were demanding their land back, and they were also asking to have an election. They wanted to have a democratically elected sort of village representative body. And not only did they ask for it, in communist China, they got it. So in 2012, this little village in southern China held an election and elected their representatives. So the idea was to go down and write a story about how do you run a democracy if you've had no experience doing it, you're not educated, no one is helping you, and sort of the odds are stacked against you. And so I went down, and the first trip I didn't actually meet Zhuang Liahong. I heard about him, and things were going about like how you would expect them. They weren't going great. There was a lot of pressure on these people to not give the land back, and the villagers were really mad at them. And one of the village council members described the villagers as a pack of wild horses. They were so mad, they're so worked up that they were sort of impossible to reason with. And as I was doing the interviewing, I kept hearing about this guy named Zhuang Liahong, and he had been elected onto the village council and then had quit. And he was some people really loved him, and some people just couldn't stand him. He was apparently very difficult to work with. And so I sort of knew that he was around, and on my second trip, I was walking down sort of the main artery in the village, and I walked past this tea shop that was blasting Michael Jackson. There was like Michael Jackson pouring out the door of the storefront. And I was like, oh, that's funny. You don't often hear Michael Jackson being blasted in a village tea shop in China. And I was walking by, and this man just popped his head out, and he was like, hello, are you a journalist? And I was like, yes, I'm a journalist. And he said, come in. And he hid our cell phones in the back because everyone in the village at the time was convinced that their cell phones were being tapped, which might have been true. And he told me the whole story of the uprising and how it had happened. And then he said, have you heard of Patriot #1? Do you know about Patriot #1? And I was like, I've kind of heard the name. And he was like, Patriot #1, nobody knows who he is. Nobody knows. But he wrote the first sort of open letter about our land being stolen. Had been penned by Patriot #1, and of course, he was being coy about it. But Zhuang Liahong was Patriot #1. It became pretty obvious pretty quickly, and so I spent I spent, it was probably a year and a half going back and forth to that village, and every time I went, I would meet Zhuang, and he would have me back to his little house with his wife, little Yan, and she would cook, and they had a baby named Kaizhi. And I at the same time, I was moving back to New York, and I came back to New York and was going to write the story about this sort of failed effort at democracy. Things were really being sort of cracked down on. And it lost touch with them. It wasn't in constant touch with them. And all of a sudden, I got a text of 2 photos, no explanation, just 2 photos. And one of them was Zhuang Lihong and little Yan standing by a beach. And Zhuang Lihong was like super excited. And little Yan was standing there like, she did not laugh. She was not excited to be at this beach. She was not pumped. And then the second picture was Zhuang Lihong on a motorcycle in a mall somewhere. And I was like, huh, that's weird. Like, maybe he meant to send these to someone else. Like, this could be a beach anywhere, and this could be a mall anywhere. And then the next day, I got a phone call. It was like a crackling line. You couldn't really hear what was going on. And Zhuang Lihong said, it was Lauren, and my name in Chinese is Lolan, so he's like, Lolan, I'm in Hawaii. And I was like, what? And he was like, and I might see you soon. And I was like, what? How did this, what's going on? How did you get to Hawaii? What's happening? And he's like, sorry, I can't talk about it now. I'm on somebody else's phone, and hung up. So I was like, great. Zhuang Lihong is coming to America. And over the next 2 weeks, he started contacting me. He was like in San Francisco, and then LA, and then San Diego, and I slowly came to the realization that Zhuang had gotten himself, he had left his son behind with little Yan's parents, and he had gotten himself and his wife on a Chinese tour of the Western United States. And they planned to leave it. And they not only were they going to leave it and stay in the United States, they were going to come to New York, and they fully intended to stay with me. And there was like, and once you get to know Zhuang Lihong, there's no stopping him once he's like, he started a village revolution. You can't stop this man once he's decided he's going to do something. So about a week later, a cab taxied, and it was in 2014. I don't know if you remember the winter here in 2014. It was incredibly cold. It was snowing. These are 2 people from southern China. They'd never seen snow before. And they popped out of this cab in these gigantic puffy coats that they had bought that were like Michelin people. And they had 2 tiny bags with them because they didn't want to let on that they were leaving the country. And they showed up at my house, and Zhuang Lihong walked in, and he said, I have a plan. I'm going to live in Flushing, Queens. I need to get an apartment and a cell phone and a green card. And that's how it's going to go. And so the book, that's actually really the start of the book, is with Zhuang showing up on my doorstep. And over the next 2.5 years, I follow him, and the book follows him and his wife as they sort of look for their first apartment. And an apartment is not the right word. They look for their first tiny room in a shared apartment, and their first jobs, and they apply for asylum, and they try and figure out how to get their son over, because they've left their son behind, which turns out to be very common. And some things about their life really, the story was amazing for many reasons, but the things that really struck me about their time and their arrival in Queens and their time in Queens is that it wasn't like they ended up in this, there's a huge Chinese community in Flushing. Everybody speaks Mandarin. They could get around on the streets, but it didn't matter. It was incredibly isolating. For the first 2 months, they barely left this room that they had rented. And while they were sort of negotiating the day-to-day of immigrant life, which is pretty difficult, there were still things going on back at home in China that were impacting their life here, and vice versa. And I think one of the things that I hope that this book expresses is that I think a lot of immigrant stories get told, you get to Ellis Island and your story starts, and you make it, this is your story of striving in America, when really it's much more complicated than that China is still very real to them. And as they sort of grow their community over the 2 years, slowly, I began to realize this is true for for everyone. And so I think one of the things I would like to close with is that when we talk about, especially now when immigration is such a big issue, immigration is actually right now it's at its highest level that it's been since the late 1800s. The late 1800s, there was lots of people coming over, and there was a big backlash, and there started to be sort of exclusionary acts focusing on Chinese people originally, and levels dropped. In the 1950s, people weren't really coming over, and then 1965, they changed the laws, and people started coming back, and now we're back up to really high levels, and we're seeing this backlash sort of happen again. And I think within that, these individual stories are really important to tell, because the American dream is not sort of about them coming to the U.S. and becoming American. It's really about the ties, the way that they enter. It's about an individual person interweaving the stories of their previous life and their life in the United States. And different people handle it differently. For some people, China is still more real to them than the U.S., even though they're here. But it's this very interconnected, individual thing, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So Patriot #1, it's out in March. Thank you so much.